To be effective, you have to choose different methods for different situations, but they also should elicit responses that meet these criteria. And these are important because these are the criteria on the checklist for doing a good job at eliciting responses. So one thing is that they need to either maintain processing or check the accuracy of it. The second is that it needs to match the learning outcome, just like an objective needs to match the learning outcome. It also, just like an objective, needs to match student ability so that students are able to follow your directions when you elicit the response. It's also the case you should use a variety of response formats, and you choose one based on the context. You might choose a written one, you might choose a physical prompt, you might choose a verbal prompt, and so on. And finally, the responses need to maximize student involvement. And this is going to be a really important one. How do we maximize student involvement? That's going to involve, well, doing something often, getting each student to participate frequently, and not just listening to somebody else, but participating themselves. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about each of these because these are the criteria we're hoping you'll learn how to follow. In fact, we're expecting it, because otherwise you wouldn't be doing all of this. So we talked about what it means to be effective and the checklist for that. Here we're going to talk about the methods, the different ways you could possibly elicit responses. I'm going to talk briefly about this. We're going to return to these later and give you examples of ways to elicit responses. Remember that the method always involves you're asking a question or giving instruction to students. So let me give you some examples of the kind of things that you would do, some of the methods you could use. You could use a core response by saying something like, everyone, what sound does the letter K make? You could use a turn and talk by saying, turn and talk to your partner. What is the sum of 4 and 1? You could call in an individual student, although later we'll talk about some cautions about individual students, so keep that in mind. Tim, if a shape has 5 sides, it's called a what? We get Tim to respond. We could also give an instruction that doesn't explicitly evolve in a question, but gets at the same idea of a method for eliciting response. You could say, write the letter that makes the k sound in your notebook, or on a piece of paper, or on a whiteboard. Show me on your fingers the sum of 4 and 1. A response that involves a gesture. Make a pentagon with your geoboard. That's an example of one where you're using an object that's given to you for a math lesson. And finally, point to the word that has a silent E, another one that involves pointing, another gestural response. So these are just a variety of responses. We're going to talk about these and more later, but this gives you a sense of the different methods. For frequent is a really critical word here. You have to maximize those opportunities to respond. Have lots of them. That's on that checklist, the maximizing part, for a reason. And the reason is that we have to get students to do this all of the time. Students won't be engaged if you don't give them many opportunities to be engaged. And that also means that you're not just, as I already said, giving students a chance to talk about it or to answer questions one at a time and have all the rest of the students in your group listening. You need to make sure that every student gets their own opportunity to practice. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Let's finally talk to the response. Let's try to turn to the responses themselves. There are a variety of different types of responses that students might give. They might be verbal, they might be written, they might be physical. And you saw these already when we talked about how you're getting students to do it. The method will involve the response. So the method is what you're planning for students to do. The response is what in fact they do. And they could do those things in a variety of ways that link directly to the question you asked or the instruction you gave that constituted the method, right? So that's all those pieces. So now, thinking about eliciting responses using effective methods in terms of engagement, let's look at an example. So this is Ms. M. And so Ms. M is working on engaging her students using a method to elicit responses that you're going to see in a moment. So let's watch Ms. M. Let's look at how she's eliciting responses, and let's look to see if students are engaged. So here's a video. Watch with me.
Okay, so just a quick review. In equilateral triangles, Blair, what's the measure of all angles in an equilateral triangle? 60 degrees. And how did we figure that out? Mira? How did we figure out that all the angles in an equilateral triangle are 60 degrees?
Because you did the measurement. I mean, yeah.
Did the measurement?
I mean, you did like 180,
130. And where did that 180 come from?
Because the angle measures up to 100.
Exactly. In a triangle, the measurements always add up to 180. Okay? So knowing that all three of these angles are 60 degrees, then we know what about our sides? Chelsea? that they're all equal, so it's an equilateral triangle. Crystal, did you have a question? Okay, so looking at our second property is just the opposite. If our angles are equal, so we know all of our angles are 60 degrees, then our sides are the same. It's equilateral. Okay, so Michael? Yes. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some examples, just using these same triangles that we have, and figure out what kind of information we can use these properties for.
Okay, so you've had a chance now to look at Ms. M and think about how she elicited responses and how that affected students' engagements.